Ian McGill, Allens. Thank you very much for your speech, which was very informative. There's a lot of discussion. Ross Gittins had an article in the paper the other day talking about tax reform, and I think everybody is very alive to the fact that it's just not about the GST. This is a holistic discussion. But Gittins was, or put on the table, something that's been raised by a number of economists about a land tax as being another indirect tax that we might look at, a land tax. And I just wondered if you had a view about the taxation of land as being an unavoidable tax that we could perhaps put into our taxation debate.
Well, I just sort of speak spontaneously and without any authority, of course, of the party I used to lead. I'm not attracted to land taxes. I am very attracted to taxes which affect consumption as distinct from income, and we do have a form of land tax. In fact, council rates are a modest form of land tax in this country, but a general land tax, I am personally not attracted to it because it can have very unfortunate consequences on people who live in different parts of the country. If you live in a part of the country where property prices are very high and for reasons of inheritance or otherwise, you have something other than your principal place of residence, and I assume that Ross Gittins was not suggesting we tax the principal place of residence. I think if you wanted a peasant's revolt, you start taxing the family home in a bigger way. I mean, there are some things that will work in Australia, and there are some things that won't. I don't think, given the instinct amongst many people to be little capitalists, and I think it's an instinct that should be encouraged. I'm not personally attracted to it, but perhaps there are people in this room who are. I'm not. I'm not surprised Ross has written that way, though. He's a good writer. I always enjoy. He is, in my view, about as easy to understand writer on economics you could find anywhere. And I don't say that facetiously. I have great respect for his skills. I don't always agree with his economic arguments, but I do admire his felicity with the English language. Facility, right?
Mr. Howard, John Kunkel from the Minerals Council of Australia.
Yes, John.
Firstly, thank you very much for your kind words about the resources industry, I have to say that, and very good speech. Can I ask you, you talked about, in a sense, the hollowing out or the narrowing of the political parties in Australia over time. Do you see any ray of hope in that changing? Because you also talked about not, in a sense, going too far in terms of democratisation of electing leaders of parties. I guess my point, though, is in someone like Malcolm Turnbull, who has obviously a degree of attraction across the political spectrum, especially into the professional class, do you think that there's an avenue for, in the Liberal Party, for example, for that to change the dynamic of a narrowing of the party or a hollowing out of the party over time?
Well, John, I think you have to accept that we now live in an age where people don't join organisations. They don't. When I left school, membership of all sorts of organisations in the 50s and 60s was much higher. Now it's a just-in-time generation. And I've noticed in my own children who are now into their 30s, of course, and I'm sure it's accelerated as you go down the spectrum. So people don't join. And there are a whole lot of reasons for that. The old model of Dad got home from work, dinner was on the table, and he went off to the branch meeting at the local hall. That has changed the norm. I'm not saying that's bad or good, it's just changed. So I don't think you'll ever go back to the time when the Wallara branch of the Liberal Party had 2,000 members, or the or the Granville branch of the Australian Labor Party had an equivalent number. You're not going back to that. I do think, however, that if you democratised the role, and I'm talking about the Liberal Party, the traditional role of the branch membership by introducing plebiscites for the choice of parliamentary candidates, you'd get more people involved. I mean, I live on the North Shore of Sydney, I live on the lower North Shore, and that, of course, is, I suppose, the greatest concentration of Liberal votes to be found anywhere in Australia. Now, if you were able to say to somebody, join the Killara branch of the Liberal Party or join the whatever branch of the Liberal Party, and he says in reply, well, what do I get in return? If you're able to say the next time there's a vacancy, you can play a part in choosing who your parliamentary representative is, at least that is something. I believe in the pyramid approach. And it's also hallowed, in as far as the Liberal Party is concerned, by the old understanding when Menzies formed the party, there was an implied covenant. The parliamentary party could decide the policy, but the parliamentary members, the ordinary members of the party decided who the parliamentary representatives were, and woe betide even an all-powerful Prime Minister like Bob Menzies trying to impose a candidate on the local branches who they didn't want. And that happened to him in 1956. Interestingly enough, in Malcolm Turnbull's electorate of Wentworth, when there was a vacancy and the fellow who came along, Leslie Berry, was regarded as being imposed by Menzies, and the local branches revolted, including the Wallara branch of the Liberal Party. They really revolted. Now, I think there's a place, and I'm speaking from the Liberal Party point of view, and I doubt that the Labor Party people in the room who look at their party in a sensible way would have any different attitude. I think they probably agree with me. I think at the very least, if you belong to a party and you've been a bona fide member for a period of time, you ought to have a say in who your parliamentary candidate is. And you shouldn't have those people imposed by some kind of, secondary position. Now, we've had a debate on that, and I'd like to see it go further than it has. I don't think it's gone anywhere near far enough, but I do think that would help. But I think when it comes to the parliamentary leader, because he or she has to spend so much time dealing with parliamentary colleagues and the relationship between the leader and the immediately led in any organisation is very important. I think that ought to be left to the parliamentary members, but when it comes to choosing who they are, I think anybody who pays their dues and has been in the party for a period of time ought to have a say. And I think any resistance of that in 2015 is foolish and short-sighted and only maintaining this hollowing out process, which is quite undesirable.
Up the back. Sorry, here.
Mr. Howard, Jackie Kelly from Lutheran Community Care. My question is, and thank you very much for your insightful reflections on the last many years. My question is, what kind of reforms, conversations, challenges in the industrial relations area do we need to be thinking about, influencing, having conversations around to transform and change the industrial relations environment to create the kind of future, and particularly the kind of future that creates pathways for the next generation of workers coming through?
Well, I think there are two things that you could start with that oughtn't to frighten the horses and are modest steps towards a freer system. Firstly, you should have some kind of threshold under which the number of employees in a firm can't seek unfair dismissal protection. Anybody who's run a small business knows that if you've got 5 or 6 employees and there are tens of thousands of businesses in Australia, and one of those people is causing trouble, you've got to be able to let them go without having to pay $100,000 go-away money. I think that's number one. And number two, I do think we should bring back Australian workplace agreements or individual contracts subject to a strict no disadvantage test. We had them, incidentally, for 10 years. And I acknowledge that in 2006 we made a mistake in altering the no disadvantage test. That was a mistake. and it allowed the union movement to argue that this was the beginning of Armageddon, and they got political advantage out of that, and that was a mistake for which I accept responsibility more than anybody else. If I was the Prime Minister, that's how the system works. If you win something, the Prime Minister gets most of the credit, but if you muck something up, he gets most of the blame. And I think that's only fair. So I think they are two modest changes that would make people more familiar with a freer system. And I also think, thirdly, some of the right of entry rules that operate under the Fair Work Act are too... I think they are too draconian, and I think that ought to be... And the other one, of course, is I think we should bring back the ABCC, that's the Building and Construction Commission that came out of the first coal inquiry. The government does have legislation in the Senate on that, and I do hope that the micro parties find it in themselves to support that change, because it certainly brought a lot of productivity improvements in Melbourne and Perth, which had very, very bad industrial relations records in the building and construction industry.
Mr. Howard, good evening. I'm Margaret Jack from Adecco. I have a subject very close to my heart, which is youth unemployment. Last year I said this, and this year the situation has deteriorated. 40% of our graduates cannot find employment within 6 months after graduation. And our universities continue to churn out graduates that many employers do not want. There's a major skills mismatch. What can we do to reform our education system so we can have greater matching between what employer want and what the graduates can do in finding employment? Thank you.
Margaret, I don't think there's any quick answer to that. It is in part a product, and this may sound selfish because I was a beneficiary of a university education, and I guess a lot of people in this room fall into the same category, but it's in part a product of a period that we passed through when we elevated going through to year 12 and having a university education way above any other kind of educational outcome. I know it sounds nostalgic to say, but we used to have an education system that included technical schools. Now that was, of course, at a time when there were a lot more trade opportunities available, although my mail tells me that there's still a chronic shortage of skilled tradesmen in many disciplines. So I think there's no short answer to that, because there's still an enormous attraction to a university education, and there are glamour industries. Finance is still a glamour industry, although there are tens of thousands of people who used to be in financial services who are now out of work, I'm told, in this city. But it's something that over a period of time we may adjust to. If you look at unemployment in an aggregate fashion, it's actually remained lower than I thought it might do several years ago. And I don't know whether that figure last week was a bit of an aberration, but even if it's not an aberration, unemployment is hovering around 6%. It went to 11% in 1991, and it went to something like that in 1981. So it does mean that we've probably got something on the employment front right, but I think the change to the issue that you've addressed is something that will happen over time, and the thing that will sort it out, as normally sorts out most of these anomalies or glitches or whatever, or maladies, is the market. As the market ceases to demand so many graduates in certain disciplines, fewer people will be attracted into them.
Mr Howard, Dick Warburton. We can't take the opportunity of having persons such as yourself here in light of what's been happening in Paris in the last weekend and overall in the whole ISIL, whatever you like to call it, Daesh situation. How do you see that all unfolding as we go forward?
Dick, like everybody else, I was horrified about what happened. It was totally random. The worrying thing about what happened in Paris was that it was a fairly unsophisticated operation from a technical point of view. It didn't take an enormous amount of complicated organisation in the way that, for example, the attacks of the 11th of September took. Now, I know it may sound clinical and harsh to talk about something like this in such terms, but I think we've got to do that to understand the nature of the challenge. One of the problems that Europe has is and this was pointed out in a, I thought, brilliant column in the Financial Review yesterday by the former colonel in charge of the Royal Irish Regiment that fought in Iraq, where he said that one of the problems Europe has is that it is awash with weapons coming out of the Balkans. The Balkan Civil War produced enormous quantities of weapons, and that the whole system is awash with them, particularly those in continental Europe. The possibility of, Tim Collins was this fellow's name, the possibility of there being further attacks of this kind is quite high. I think the French reaction is perfectly understandable. I think the comments that Malcolm Turnbull has made are spot on. He has said that it's got to be dealt with in both militarily and also politically. I encourage the hope that there may be a political settlement of some kind in Syria. And if in fact Obama and Putin have had a meeting of minds on that, that's a good thing. I don't know yet for sure whether they have. That solution has got to involve in the short term Bashar al-Assad, butcher and murderer he may be. And Joseph Stalin had killed millions of people when we made common cause with him to fight Adolf Hitler after the invasion of Russia in 1941. And if it takes some kind of interim deal which leaves Bashar al-Assad in place for a period of time and some kind of arrangement about his future to bring peace in Syria, that is a price worth paying. You should never allow the perfect to become the enemy of the good when you bring about some kind of settlement. So, but in the meantime, it's important that IS, the Islamic State, suffer defeats on the battlefield, because a lot of their appeal is based on, look how good we are. Every time they have a successful operation, they use the social media to advertise it and say, join the cause. We are dealing with a group of absolute fanatics, and they are invoking their religion. I mean, there's no point in mincing words about that. There's no point in dancing around the fact that these people are arguing a perverted application of Islam. I noticed that's been said by Najib, the Islamic Prime Minister of Malaysia. It's been said by the President of Turkey. And I think we should be very direct in understanding this, because I think it will get the whole community to understand the challenge that we have. But I'd like to say otherwise, but this is going to be with us for a long time. But it's important we tackle it on both military and political fronts. I'm not attracted to the idea, some people have answered, it can only be solved politically. In the long run, yes, it can only be solved politically. But in the short run, you have to deny them battlefield successes to bring about the conditions for political change. And certainly in Syria, and of course, the breakdown of the Syrian state is responsible for the hundreds of thousands of refugees that are now flooding into Europe. And that is an even bigger problem in the long run for Europe than the sort of things that we've had in Paris. I mean, they're both terrible to contemplate. I do think that Europe has a massive problem with the refugees, and the source of that problem is the breakdown of the Syrian state. I think the imperative of trying to reach some kind of political solution there is right at the top of the list, but you won't create the circumstances in which that occurs without continued successes of some kind on the battlefield. Now, what combination of air power and army and so forth is needed, and who contributes is of course a matter for those who've got the responsibility for making those decisions. And I won't get drawn into that at this stage, but I think it's important to understand that both military success, because these people feed off success. They attract people to support them through pointing to their successes. And every time, they will use the attack in Paris as a recruiting device. Terrible thing to think, but they will. And I think the reaction of the French is perfectly understandable. But I think also that both the Americans and the Europeans have been pretty complacent. I think the threat of terrorism has been around longer than many of their leaders have wanted to believe. And this has been a terrible reminder of how big a challenge we face.
Mr. Howard, Baden Firth, Mitsubishi. To draw the focus back to our region, do you think that there is really an emerging debt crisis in emerging markets, emerging countries around this region, in particular Asia? And if so, what does that mean for the Fed? What does it mean, by extension, for the Australian economy?
Do you think the opportunities for Australia in the emerging markets of our region, what do I think of those opportunities?
Sorry, sir, the debt crisis.
Oh, the debt crisis.
Is there an emerging debt crisis?
In the countries in our region, or for us? Or both?
Both.
Well, we don't have a debt crisis, but nor should we be complacent about the level of our debt. It's all a question of having a sensible, balanced attitude. Our debt position is a lot worse than it was when my government lost in 2007. We didn't have any debt then. So it's obviously deteriorated. Now, some of the reasons for that I understand. We did have a global financial crisis, and when you have that, the automatic stabilisers in the budget come into play. I accept all of that. But I do think that we cannot afford to be complacent. We still have a spending problem, and we still need to address that problem. Is there a debt crisis in other countries? Well, in some parts of the region, the debt to GDP ratio is much higher. It's off the chart in Japan. Japan's got a greater debt to GDP ratio than Greece. On the other hand, of course, Japan has a treasure trove of domestic savings, and they have a capacity to handle their debt that no other country has. So I think many of the challenges that we have in our part of the world are similar to what other countries have. I think as far as China is concerned, two things I'd observe about China. She's going to remain our best customer for years into the future. Even though commodity prices have come off the boil, there'll still be very heavy demand coming out of China for our resources, and providing we're sensible in not in any way impeding our resources by foolishly placed climate change policies. And, I remain, as many of you know, a bit of an agnostic when it comes to many aspects of climate change policy. Providing we're sensible in that department, we should continue to see China as being an enormously valuable market. But China has got the huge problem of demography. As the years go by, China will grow old before she grows rich, to use that cliche. India, by contrast, is the opposite. India has an incredibly young population, and I think in all come back here in 50 years' time, it'll be very interesting to compare the economic journey of China and against the economic journey of India.
Hi, John Lydon from McKinsey. Just hypothetically, let's say you were the leader of the Liberal Party, the Prime Minister today. What would be your view on a good time to call the next election?
I think that you call the next election at a time when you think your opportunity of being successful is maximised. But can I tell you very seriously that one of the factors I would take into account is that Australians are very cynical about elections that are called without good reason ahead of time. Their attitude is that it's only 3 years, and if they see an election called without apparent justification, the natural Australian scepticism clicks in, and they say, what's he up to? Or what is he trying to keep from us? My belief is that the next election will be called in about September of next year when it's due. That's the indication the Prime Minister's given. The other thing you've got to bear in mind is that if you call the election before a certain date next year, I think it's August, you'll end up having to have a separate half-Senate election because the senators have a fixed term of 3 years. And we don't want to bring back half-Senate elections. They're a pain in the neck, and they're a heaven-sent opportunity for a protest vote against an incumbent government, no matter how well it might be going.